The scent of ozone and cordite filled the air as Mara slid behind the bar, the polished wood now a barricade. They should have known better, she thought, reloading her weapon with a practiced click, than to corner a ghost in her own haunt. The men hunting her were the best, a ruthless private army sent by a man she had personally erased from the world years ago, but she had no idea the one leading the assault, the one whose voice she heard barking orders through the chaos, was the one person she'd spared all those years ago. A loose end she thought had vanished forever. Could she survive a fight against an enemy who knew her tactics? Or would the ghost of her past finally claim her? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The day began, as it always did, in the quiet dark. Long before the first hint of dawn bruised the sky, Mara Quinn was already at work inside the Anchor, an off-duty officers' club that felt more like a shrine to faded glories than a place of leisure. The air was a familiar cocktail, thick and heavy with the ghosts of last night's revelry, a blend of stale beer, sharp lemon polish, and the deep, comforting scent of old, dark wood. For Mara, this was the smell of peace, the aroma of anonymity. She moved through the dim, pre-dawn light with a precision that bordered on ritualistic. Her focus was absolute, a laser beam of concentration in the gloom, whether she was wiping down the sticky residue from a tabletop or polishing a pint glass until it gleamed without flaw under the single work light she kept on over the bar. Her movements were economical, fluid, and devoid of any wasted energy. She was a woman in her late 30s, though the deep-settled weariness in her eyes could have belonged to someone decades older. It was a stark contrast to the coiled stillness in her posture, a latent energy held carefully in reserve, like a spring wound tight. Her uniform was a plain, charcoal, grey jumpsuit, a deliberately forgettable garment designed to make her blend into the background, to become just another shadow in a room full of them. She was scenery, a part of the building's function, and that was exactly how she needed it to be. Her only personal item, the sole deviation from herself, imposed austerity, was a worn, steel dog tag. It wasn't on a chain around her neck, where it might be seen, but fastened securely to the strap of her simple, functional wristwatch. The metal was cool and solid against her skin, a constant, hidden pressure that was both a reminder and a warning. Most of the time, it remained concealed by her sleeve, a secret kept between her and the steady pulse in her wrist. The cleaning was a meditation. Wipe, rinse, polish, repeat. Each completed task was a small victory against the chaos that always threatened at the edges of her mind. The physical repetition kept the memories at bay, anchoring her firmly in the present, in the tangible world of soap, water, and wood. It was a willed anonymity, a peace she had fought harder to win than any battle in her former life. As the evening approached, the character of the Anchor transformed. The quiet sanctuary of Mara's morning became a bustling hub of noise and life. The doors opened, and the evening crowd trickled in, a mix of commissioned officers and enlisted personnel seeking refuge and camaraderie. The loudest and most boisterous group, as usual, was a table of Navy SEALs, fresh from a grueling training rotation and radiating an aura of invincible youth and confidence. They occupied a large round table in the corner, their laughter and loud stories dominating the room's acoustics. Their voices, filled with operational jargon and inside jokes, were a language Mara understood perfectly but had long since abandoned. She moved around them like a ghost, a phantom in a grey jumpsuit. She refilled pretzel bowls, her hands moving with swift, silent efficiency. She mopped a small spill near their table, her presence so unobtrusive that one of the men nearly tripped over her, offering a cursory, distracted apology without ever truly seeing her face. She was invisible, and she preferred it that way. It was a self-imposed exile from the very world they inhabited with such vibrant, unapologetic life. To be unseen was to be safe. To be forgotten was to be free. At the head of the SEALs table sat Jackson Thorne, known to everyone as Jax. He was a seasoned operator, older than the others by a decade, with observant eyes that missed nothing. He watched the room with a casual but professional awareness, a habit ingrained so deeply it was as natural as breathing. He laughed along with his men, but his gaze was always moving, assessing, cataloguing. He saw the way the bartender favored his left hand, the slight limp of the old Master Chief at the end of the bar, the nervous tick of a young ensign trying too hard to look comfortable. His eyes slid over Mara a dozen times, registering her only as staff, a functional object in the environment, no more noteworthy than a chair or a light fixture. A younger operator named Kai, full of swagger and the kind of reckless energy that hadn't yet been tempered by true combat, was in the middle of an exaggerated story about a training exercise. So the instructor is screaming, but the water is so cold my lips won't move. I'm trying to say hoo-yah, but it's coming out like hoo-ha, hoo-ha. The table erupted in laughter. Mara, standing behind the bar with her back to the room, felt the vibrations through the soles of her shoes. She was polishing glasses, her movements a steady hypnotic rhythm. The work was mindless, allowing her thoughts to drift. She felt a familiar pang, a dull ache of something lost, watching them. They were so alive, so connected to one another, a brotherhood forged in shared hardship. She had known a bond like that once, a lifetime ago. It was a door she had closed and locked herself. She reached for another glass from the rack, her arm extending, her wrist turning in the dim, amber light of the bar. For a single fateful second, the worn dog tag, her secret anchor to a buried past, swung out from beneath the cuff of her jumpsuit. It was a tiny pendulum, a small piece of steel catching the light, spinning just once before falling back into shadow. It was nothing, a flicker of movement in a room full of motion. But it was enough. Across the room, Jax Thorne froze. His laugh died in his throat, his beer mug held halfway to his lips. His teammates' voices faded into a dull roar as his focus narrowed, his professional gaze transforming into something sharp, intense, and disbelieving. His eyes locked onto the small piece of metal that had briefly appeared and vanished. The name on the tag was obscured by the distance and the fleeting glimpse, but that wasn't what he saw. He saw the unique, non-regulation way it was fastened to the watch strap, a specific modification he had only ever seen one person use. He saw the distinct wear pattern on its edges, a series of tiny, almost imperceptible notches that he knew were not from combat, but from a nervous habit, from being twisted between a thumb and forefinger during countless hours of silent surveillance. The laughter at the table continued for a moment before sputtering out, one by one, as the other SEALs noticed their team leader's sudden, absolute stillness. "Jax, you good man?" Kai asked, his story forgotten. Jax didn't answer. He squinted, his body leaning forward as if trying to will the tag to reappear. He slowly placed his mug on the table, the heavy glass making a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden pocket of silence around them. With a deliberation that set every nerve in the room on edge, he pushed his chair back and stood up. His teammates watched in confusion as he began to walk slowly, purposefully, toward the bar. He moved with the predatory grace of a man stalking a target, his eyes never leaving the back of the gray-clad woman who was still methodically polishing glasses, seemingly oblivious. He stopped a few feet from her, the low thrum of the bar's coolers filling the space between them. The rest of the room, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to quiet down. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Jax's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper, a low, incredulous breath that was somehow more powerful than a shout. "Crimson 9?" Mara didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or turn. But for a fraction of a second, a single, skipped heartbeat, her hands stilled. The rhythmic circular motion of the cloth against the glass paused, a minute break in the perfect, unbroken ritual. It was the only sign she gave that the name had pierced the thick armor of her anonymity. She held the pose for a beat, then deliberately, methodically, finished polishing the glass. She placed it on the overhead rack with a soft, final click. Only then did she allow her shoulders to relax, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, a calm mask she had perfected over 5 long years. But as her eyes met his, a faint, sad smile touched her lips, a ghost of a smile for a ghost of a name. "Haven't heard that name in years," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The words dropped into the bar like a stone into a perfectly still pond. The remaining murmurs of conversation ceased. The clinking of glasses stopped. The jukebox in the corner seemed to fade into the background. Every SEAL at the table, and a handful of older officers scattered around the room who knew the significance of the name, fell completely, utterly silent. The air, once filled with boisterous laughter, became electric, charged with a tension so thick it was almost visible. The bubble of Mara's quiet, invisible life had not just been pricked, it had been shattered. Her past, the violent, legendary past she had tried so desperately to bury, had just walked up to her bar and called her by name. The first person to break the spell was Al, the bar manager. A portly man whose world consisted of inventory sheets and profit margins. He bustled forward from his office, his face a thundercloud of indignation. "What in Sam Hill is going on here? Thorne, your men causing trouble? And you," he said, pointing a thick finger at Mara, Get back to work. This isn't a social club." Jax didn't even look at him. His focus was a tangible force, locked entirely on Mara. The other SEALs, who had been frozen in a state of stunned silence, now began to stir, their training kicking in. They didn't move aggressively, but they shifted, their bodies subtly repositioning to form a loose, protective circle around their leader and the woman he had just named. Their expressions were a volatile cocktail of awe, raw disbelief, and a dawning, professional suspicion. They were looking at a myth, a bedtime story told to recruits, and she was standing right in front of them, smelling of bleach and lemon polish. "The mission in Odessa," Jax said, his voice still low but now carrying the hard edge of an interrogation, the one they scrubbed from every record. "They said the operative was a ghost, that they went in alone and dismantled Volkov's entire syndicate from the inside. They said the ghost was KIA on exfil. That was you, wasn't it?" Mara's sad smile didn't waver, but her eyes were distant, looking at a memory he couldn't see. "Ghosts don't leave footprints, Sergeant," she replied, her voice a soft counterpoint to his intensity. "And they certainly don't die. They just fade. I cleaned up a mess, that's all." Kai, the young, brash SEAL, finally found his voice. He took a half-step forward, his face a mask of incredulity. "No way. No, Crimson 9 isn't real. She's a story, a legend they tell us at BUD-S. A boogeyman to scare recruits into checking their corners and respecting their instructors." He looked from Jax to Mara, searching for the punchline to a joke he didn't understand. For the first time, Mara's gaze shifted, leaving Jax to land on Kai. The placid, weary look in her eyes sharpened into something ancient and incredibly dangerous. It was like watching a placid lake instantly freeze into hard, clear ice. The sheer force of her attention made the young SEAL take an involuntary step back. "The boogeyman," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more chilling than any shout, "is who you send to hunt other boogeymen." The statement hung in the air, an undeniable truth. The other SEALs exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard the stories, the whispers in briefing rooms and the redacted after. Action reports that hinted at a level of black operations that made their own clandestine work look like a public parade. An operative who worked with no team, no support, and no official existence. Crimson 9, the ghost who haunted the shadows of geopolitical conflict, the final, unspoken solution when all other options were exhausted. They asked more questions, their voices overlapping in their eagerness and disbelief. They spoke of the hostage rescue in Yemen, where the target was extracted from a fortified compound with no shots fired, of the diplomat in Vienna who vanished a day before he could sell state secrets, of a network of arms dealers in South America that collapsed overnight. To each whispered legend, Mara gave nothing but silence or a cryptic, evasive answer that only deepened the mystery. She was a living ghost, and she was not giving up her secrets. Far away, in a city of glass and steel, the world was a different color. In a penthouse apartment in Geneva that was less a home and more a sterile monument to wealth and power, a man named Alexei Volkov stared at a tablet. The apartment was a study in minimalist luxury, all white marble, black leather, and chrome, with a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god's eye view of the city lights sparkling like a carpet of scattered diamonds below. Volkov, a man in his late 50s, was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He was the picture of legitimate, old-world power, a man who belonged on the boards of global corporations. But his eyes, the color of chips of ice, held a cold, predatory stillness that spoke of a much different, much bloodier world. He was the sole survivor of the Odessa operation, the mess Mara had cleaned up. She had dismantled his criminal empire, exposed his network, and left him for dead, a ruined man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning, all-consuming hatred. He had spent 5 years rebuilding, piece by painful piece, transforming his illicit gains into a legitimate global syndicate, but the foundation of his new empire was built on the bedrock of that old hatred. A nervous aide, a young man with a sweat-sheened brow, entered the room, his expensive shoes silent on the polished marble. He held a tablet of his own, his hand trembling slightly. "Sir," he began, his voice tight, "we have a credible report from a source near the naval base in Virginia." Volkov did not look up from his screen. He continued to scroll through stock market data, his expression unchanged. "The name," he said, his voice a low, chilling monotone. "Say the name." The aide swallowed hard, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Crimson 9, he whispered, as if afraid the words themselves might bite him. "She's alive." For a long moment, Volkov remained perfectly still. Then, with excruciating slowness, he raised his head. A smile spread across his face, a terrifying, mirthless expression that did not touch his eyes. It was the smile of a predator that has just caught the scent of its long-lost prey. He slowly, almost tenderly, raised a hand and touched a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. It was a barely visible line, a ghost of a wound. But to him, it was a permanent reminder. A ghost, he mused, his voice soft with a terrible kind of reverence. She left me with nothing but a memory, and this small gift. His smile widened. Find her, mobilize the hunters. I want her to know what it feels like to be haunted. I want the ghost to know the terror of seeing her own reflection in the dark. Back at the anchor, the last of the regular patrons had been ushered out, leaving only the seals and Mara in the cavernous empty room. Closing time had come and gone, but the team had refused to leave, their protective instincts overriding Al's blustering threats to call base security. The manager had finally thrown his hands up in a huff and left, leaving Mara alone with the legends of her past and the men who worshipped them. They sat at the large round table, the same one where they had been laughing just an hour before. Now, the mood was somber, heavy with unspoken questions. The half-empty pretzel bowls and discarded napkins seemed like artifacts from a different era. Jax leaned forward, his forearms resting on the sticky table, his expression earnest. You're exposed, he said, his voice low and serious. That name, Crimson Nine, it's not just a legend to us. It's a legend to our enemies. If word is out that you're alive, and it will be, they will come for you. The people you've crossed, the ones who survived, they don't forget. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. We can protect you. We have resources, safe houses. We can get you out of the country, give you a new identity. Mara looked down at her hands, studying the calluses on her palms and the faint scars that crisscrossed her knuckles. They were the hands of a cleaner, a laborer, but they were also the hands of a killer. She slowly shook her head, the movement full of a profound and unshakable weariness. You don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. The people who might come for me, they don't play by your rules. They don't operate in the world, you know. To them, a safe house isn't a fortress. It's just a box. Putting me in one of your safe houses is just putting a target on a box. You wouldn't be protecting me, you'd be painting a bullseye on your own backs, on the backs of everyone you care about. Her gaze lifted, and she looked at each of them in turn. Her eyes filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. They will burn down the world around me just to watch me choke on the smoke. I've seen it happen before. I won't let it happen again. The memory was a flash of fire and screaming, of friendly faces contorted in pain, a cost she had sworn she would never again ask anyone to pay. The seals were silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. They were warriors, the best in the world, but they were beginning to realize that they were out of their depth, staring into an abyss of violence and shadow they had only ever read about in redacted files. Jax's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He was a man used to having a plan, to being in control. The frustration was evident in his eyes, but it was mixed with something else, a dawning fascination. He was looking at a woman who had walked through a hell he could only imagine and had come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. Then what's your plan? He asked, the question hanging in the silent empty bar. Mara looked away, her gaze drifting towards the polished bar, the rows of gleaming glasses, the quiet order she had created. The same as it's been for 5 years, she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Disappear. Mara left the anchor long after the seals had finally, reluctantly, departed. The promise she'd made to disappear felt like ash in her mouth, a hollow echo of a strategy that had already failed. For 5 years, she had been a ghost of her own making, and it had taken a single, careless swing of her wrist to bring the entire haunted house crashing down. The walk back to her apartment was different tonight. The familiar streets of the quiet, residential neighborhood no longer felt safe. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, to twist into unnatural shapes. The rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze sounded like a whisper. The headlights of a passing car sweeping across the pavement felt like the beam of a searchlight. She was seeing the world through different eyes now, the old eyes, the ones that saw threats in every corner and calculated angles of attack from every rooftop. The weariness was still there, a deep physical ache in her bones, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, crackling hum of adrenaline. It was a feeling she knew intimately, the feeling of being hunted. Her apartment was on the second floor of a nondescript brick building, a small, Spartan space that was more of a cell than a home. It was clean, meticulously organized, and utterly impersonal. There were no photographs, no books, no decorations. It was a place to sleep and eat, a transient's way station that she had inhabited for 5 years. It was a testament to her belief that if you owned nothing, you had nothing to lose. As she approached her own front door, her hand reaching into her pocket for the key, she stopped. Her body went rigid. Her gaze was fixed, not on the door, but on the window to the left of it. Everything appeared normal. The blinds were drawn, just as she had left them. The lock on the window was secure. But on the outer sill, a space she wiped clean every single morning without fail, there was a small, dark object. It was a flower, a single, perfect black orchid, its petals the color of a starless midnight sky, its texture like velvet. It sat innocently on the painted brick, a splash of impossible elegance against the drab facade. To anyone else, it would be a strange, perhaps romantic gesture. To Mara, it was a declaration of war. The black orchid had been the calling card of a particularly vicious assassin she had been tasked with eliminating years ago, an operation that had been sanctioned and funded by a then-fledgling Alexei Volkov. It was a message from him, a piece of psychological warfare as subtle as a whisper and as brutal as a knife to the throat. He was telling her that he knew where she lived, that he could get to her, that her sanctuary was no longer safe. He was showing her that he remembered the details of her past as well as she did. All the exhaustion that had clung to her like a shroud evaporated, burned away by a surge of pure, cold focus. She did not enter the apartment. She did not even touch the door. She knew it would be clean. There would be no signs of forced entry, no tripwires, no explosives. That wasn't Volkov's style for a first move. This was about fear. This was about reminding her that she was prey. She backed away slowly, her footsteps silent on the concrete walkway. She melted back into the shadows of the street, her earlier paranoia now justified, her senses screaming. She moved through a series of back alleys she had mapped in her mind years ago, her path a weaving, unpredictable line. She ended up in a small, overgrown park 2 blocks away, a place she had identified as a potential dead drop or emergency cache location. Behind a loose brick in a low retaining wall, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, heavy object. A burner phone. It was an old, featureless device she had kept hidden and charged for 5 years, a relic of a life she had prayed she would never have to return to. She powered it on, the small screen glowing with a faint blue light. She dialed a number she had committed to memory, a number she hadn't called in 1,826 days. The phone on the other end picked up after a single ring. There was no voice, only the faint, static hiss of an open line. "The black orchid has bloomed again," Mara said into the phone, her voice low and steady, devoid of any emotion. "I need a weather report." She didn't wait for a reply. She ended the call, powered the phone off, and replaced it in its hiding spot. The psychological warfare had begun. Volkov was haunting her, and now she had to awaken a ghost of her own. The next day, Jax and Kai sat in an unmarked sedan a block away from Mara's apartment building. Jax's jaw was tight with a mixture of concern and frustration. "She said to stay away," Kai said, fidgeting with the strap of his seatbelt. "She said we'd be painting a target on our backs." "And she's probably right," Jax conceded, his eyes fixed on the building's entrance. "But we're not leaving a friendly asset exposed with a potential threat in the area. We're SEALs. It's not what we do. We'll be a ghost team. She'll never even know we're here." His confidence lasted less than an hour. When Mara emerged from the building, she was not the slow, weary cleaning woman from the bar. She moved with a purpose and an awareness that was unnerving. Her routine was completely different. Instead of taking the direct bus route to the naval base, she walked in the opposite direction, heading towards the bustling downtown area. Her path was anything but direct. She would walk for 2 blocks, then abruptly cross the street and double back, pausing to look in a shop window, her eyes not on the display but on the reflection of the street behind her. She entered a crowded coffee shop, only to exit through a secondary door into a back alley a minute later. She was a fish swimming through a complex reef, and Jax and Kai, in their cumbersome sedan, were the sharks, too large and obvious to follow her into the tight spaces. "She knows," Kai said, gripping the steering wheel in frustration as they lost her for the 3rd time. "She has to know we're here. Just keep a loose tail." Jax ordered, his own professional pride stinging. "Don't get made." They were experts in surveillance, the best of the best. They had tailed high-value targets through the crowded souks of the Middle East and the dense jungles of South America. And here they were, in a mid-sized American city, being effortlessly spotted and evaded by a woman they were trying to protect. She was playing with them. She led them on a winding, frustrating chase for nearly 2 hours before her path seemed to straighten, leading them towards a large, public park in the center of the city. She walked in, found an empty bench overlooking a duck pond, and sat down, pulling a newspaper from a nearby bin. She looked for all the world like a woman enjoying a quiet afternoon. Jax and Kai parked the car and followed on foot, keeping their distance, using trees and crowds of people as cover. "Okay, let's set up here," Jax murmured, finding a spot with a clear view of her bench. "We'll hold this position and see what she does." He felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He ignored it, his focus entirely on Mara. It buzzed again, insistent. With a sigh of annoyance, he pulled it out, expecting a message from his team. It was a text from an unknown number. He frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen before he opened it. The message was short, and it made the blood run cold in his veins. It read, "Your 6 is compromised. The man in the red hat sitting on the bench to your right is armed. The woman pushing the stroller with the blue blanket is his spotter. You're good at what you do, but you're loud. Go home." Jax's head snapped up. His gaze flicked to the right. There he was, a man in a faded red baseball cap, seemingly reading a book. But his posture was all wrong, too rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd. Jax's gaze then found the woman with the stroller. She was cooing at the bundle of blue blankets, but her path was a slow, deliberate circle, and her eyes kept flicking towards the man in the red hat, and then towards Jax and Kai's position. They were professionals, and they were not watching Mara. They were watching the 2 men who were watching Mara. They were a surveillance team. Kai saw the look on Jax's face. "What is it?" Jax slowly lowered the phone, his face pale. "We've been made," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And not by her." He showed Kai the message. Kai's eyes widened in disbelief, his face flushing with a mixture of shock and professional humiliation. They had been so focused on their target that they had completely missed the real threat, the hunters who were stalking the same prey. Mara had not only spotted her amateurish tail, she had also identified the professionals who were tailing them. She had turned the tables completely, using her supposed protectors as bait to draw out her enemies. She wasn't just the hunted anymore. She was actively gathering intelligence, and she was 3 steps ahead of everyone. The legend of Crimson 9 wasn't just a collection of old stories. Her skills were not rusty, they were razor-sharp, and she had just used them to prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that in this world of ghosts and shadows, she was still the apex predator. Mara did not return to her compromised apartment. The message from Volkov was clear, and her counter, move in the park, had been just as clear. She was not prey to be cornered. She checked into a nondescript motel on the industrial outskirts of the city, paying in cash under a name that didn't exist. The room was stale and smelled of disinfectant, but it was anonymous and, for now, it was safe. She spent the next several hours in a state of heightened awareness, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and contingencies. She was no longer just trying to disappear. She was preparing for a war. Late that night, the burner phone, which she had retrieved from its hiding place, buzzed on the cheap motel nightstand. It was a single, encrypted data burst. The weather report had arrived. She connected the phone to a small, modified tablet she carried in a hidden compartment of her worn duffel bag. The screen flickered to life, displaying a dossier on Alexei Volkov. It was a comprehensive intelligence file, far more detailed than anything an official agency could have compiled. It detailed his meteoric rise from the ashes of his Odessa operation. He was no longer just a black market arms dealer. He was a legitimate corporate titan, the CEO of a multinational logistics company called Volkov Global Transit. The company was a front. Of course, a massive, intricate web that provided the perfect cover for his real business, a private, illicit syndicate that dealt in everything from weapons to intelligence to political destabilization. He was richer, more powerful, and better connected than he had ever been. The file was filled with photographs of him shaking hands with diplomats, attending lavish charity galas, and standing on the steps of stock exchanges. He had laundered his past, burying it under a mountain of legitimate money. Mara scrolled through the data, her expression grim. This was worse than she had imagined. Volkov had not just survived, he had thrived. He had learned from his mistakes. His new organization was decentralized, compartmentalized, and ruthlessly efficient. He had built a fortress of corporate law and plausible deniability around himself. But as she scrolled further, a photograph appeared that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a recent picture, taken at a corporate event in Dubai. Volkov stood in the center, smiling his cold reptilian smile, and standing just behind his right shoulder, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit and wearing the impassive expression of a professional security man, was a face she had prayed she would never see again. It was a face she saw in her nightmares, a face she had personally reported as killed in action 5 years ago. Dmitri. A wave of cold dread washed over her, so intense it felt like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs, and a profound, sickening guilt churned in her stomach. He had been so young back then, barely out of training, his eyes shining with a fierce, idealistic loyalty. He had been assigned to her for the Odessa mission, his first deep cover operation. He was supposed to be her inside man, her asset within Volkov's organization. But the mission had gone sideways. Their communications had been compromised. She had been forced to make a choice, an impossible, brutal choice that was the cold calculus of her profession. The objective, to dismantle Volkov's entire network and prevent the sale of a dirty bomb, or the life of her young, compromised operative. She had made the call. She had completed the mission, and she had filed the report, her last report, stating that Dmitri had been discovered and executed. The guilt from that decision had been a primary motivator for her disappearance, a weight she had carried every single day in her quiet, self-imposed exile. And now, here he was, alive. Not only alive, but standing at the right hand of the very man she had left him to die to destroy. The realization was a dagger in her heart. He hadn't died. He had survived, and in his survival, he had found a new master. Volkov had likely found him, broken and abandoned, and had twisted his loyalty, turning his pain and sense of betrayal into a weapon aimed directly at her. This changed everything. The threat was no longer just professional. It was deeply, agonizingly personal. She wasn't just fighting an old villain who held a grudge. She was facing a ghost of her own making, the living, breathing consequence of her most profound failure. The haunting had truly begun, and the ghost who was coming for her wore a face she knew as well as her own. The call came on a secure, disposable phone Jax had been instructed to buy with cash from a 24-hour convenience store. There was no voice, just a text message with an address and a time. The location was not a tactical safe house or a discreet rendezvous point. It was a 24-hour industrial laundromat in a part of town that had long been forgotten by progress. The air inside was thick with steam and the chemical smell of bleach and detergent, a humid, artificial fog that clung to everything. The rhythmic churning thunder of dozens of heavy-duty washing machines provided a wall of sound, a constant, chaotic percussion that made discreet conversation impossible for anyone relying on a listening device. It was brilliant. Mara was sitting on a hard plastic chair, watching a large machine tumble a load of heavy canvas sheets, her face partially obscured by the rising steam. She looked up as Jax approached, her eyes clear and focused, the weariness replaced by a hard, crystalline purpose. She gestured to the chair beside her. "Volkov's here," she began, her voice pitched just loud enough to be heard over the mechanical roar. Not him personally. Not yet. His advance team. The ones you saw in the park were just scouts, observers. The real hunters are on their way, if they aren't here already. She laid out everything she knew, her words precise and stripped of all emotion. She spoke of Volkov's methods, not as a soldier, but as a predator. They don't attack targets, they dismantle lives. They won't come for me in a frontal assault. They'll go after the bar. They'll find Al, the manager, and leverage him. They'll dig into your lives, she said, her gaze locking onto Jax's. Your team, your families. They will find every thread of your life that matters to you, and they will pull, one by one. They'll burn everything around me to watch me suffocate on the smoke. Jax felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was a kind of warfare he was not trained for, a violation of every rule of engagement he had ever known. His instinct, his training, screamed one solution. "So we extract you," he said, his voice firm. "We get you on a secure transport, a plane to a black site. We make you disappear for real this time." Mara gave a short, humorless laugh that was swallowed by the noise of the laundromat. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You still think like a soldier. Running is what he wants. It proves he has power over me, that he can make the ghost dance, and there is no black site he can't eventually find, no new identity he can't eventually peel away. The only way to end this is to cut the head off the snake." She leaned forward, the intensity in her eyes pinning him to his seat. "I'm not running anymore. I'm setting a trap." She paused, letting the words hang in the humid air. "But I need assets. Your team, your skills, your resources, you are assets." Her gaze was unwavering, a challenge and an offer in one. "So, are you in or are you out? There's no middle ground. If you're in, you follow my orders, my plan. No questions, no deviations. I will not be responsible for getting your men killed because one of them decided to be a hero. This was the turning point. Jax looked at this woman, this legend, who had been hiding in plain sight, washing glasses and mopping floors. He saw the immense weight behind her eyes, the cost of 100 missions he could only imagine. He was a leader of the most elite warriors on the planet, but he knew, with an instinct that had kept him alive for 15 years, that he was out of his depth. Her world of shadows and whispers had its own rules, its own brutal physics. He was an instrument of force, she was an instrument of strategy. He was the hammer, she was the scalpel. He gave a single, decisive nod. "We're in," he said. "What's the first order?" Mara's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, perhaps relief, passed through her eyes. "First," she said, standing up, "we gear up." The storage unit was located in a sprawling, desolate facility near the shipyards, a place that smelled of rust and salt and decay. The unit itself was registered under the name Jane Smith, paid for in cash 5 years in advance. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, looking as if it hadn't been touched in a decade. Mara unlocked the heavy padlock and rolled up the corrugated steel door with a loud, groaning shriek. Inside, the air was stale and dry. To Jax and Kai, who had accompanied him, it looked like a tomb. A half-dozen large, sealed pelican cases were stacked neatly against the far wall. Mara moved inside and began unlatching the first case. The hiss of the pressure seal being broken was the only sound. She lifted the lid, revealing a foam interior packed with customized communications equipment, satellite phones, encrypted drives, and an array of micro-surveillance gear so advanced it made their standard issue equipment look like children's toys. Kai's eyes went wide. This is better than what we get issued," he breathed, his voice full of reverence. Mara moved to the next case without a word. This one held weapons. They were not standard military firearms. Each one was a custom piece, modified for specific purposes. There was a lightweight, collapsible sniper rifle with a carbon fiber stock, a pistol with an integrated suppressor that was impossibly small, and a variety of blades and non-lethal tools Jax didn't even recognize. Another case held stacks of currency from 24 different countries and a thick binder filled with false identity documents, passports, driver's licenses, and social security cards, each one a masterpiece of forgery, complete with a detailed backstory and a supporting digital footprint. This was a ghost's arsenal. The tools of a life lived in the cracks of the world. For the seals, it was like seeing the physical evidence of a deity. The stories were real. The legend was tangible. For Mara, opening the unit was like opening a sarcophagus. Each piece of gear carried a memory, a weight. The satellite phone was the one she'd used to listen to a target's last words to his family. The rifle was the one she'd used on a windy rooftop in Prague. The false passport with the smiling blonde woman was the identity she'd worn when she'd had to betray a friend. Stepping back into this role, touching these objects, was both empowering and soul-crushingly burdensome. She was becoming Crimson 9 again, and she could feel the ghost settling over her, its cold hands on her shoulders. She picked up a sleek, customized, lightweight rifle, its balance perfect in her hands. The cold metal felt like an extension of her own arm, a feeling she both hated and welcomed. "They issue you what you need to fight a war," she said, her voice low and resonant in the enclosed space. "This is what you need to haunt one." She turned and handed Jax one of the satellite phones, its casing heavy and cold. "This is our only line of communication from now on. Everything else, your phones, your radios, is compromised. Assume they are listening to everything." Back in the sterile anonymity of the motel room, Mara transformed it into a makeshift command center. Her tablet, connected to a series of encrypted relays she had pulled from her cache, became her window to the world. Her first move was not to build a fortress, but to seize the initiative. She was not going to wait for Volkov's hunters to find her. She was going to dictate the tempo of the conflict. Using her intimate knowledge of the financial networks Volkov had used to build his first empire, networks he would be arrogant enough to believe he had left behind, she began her attack. It was a series of digital strikes, executed with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't steal money. That was too crude, too traceable. She created chaos. She found a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands that Volkov was using to launder money for a new arms deal. With a few keystrokes, she anonymously reported it to international banking regulators, not with enough evidence to convict, but with enough to trigger a long, invasive, and costly audit. Next, she located a massive shipment of electronics belonging to Volkov Global Transit en route from Shanghai to Rotterdam. She hacked into the shipping company's logistics network and rerouted the entire shipment to a port in Nigeria, creating a bureaucratic nightmare that would take weeks and millions of dollars to untangle. Her final move was the most elegant. She created a false trail, a series of carefully placed digital breadcrumbs, encrypted messages, and faked travel logs that pointed to Crimson 9 being alive and active, but in a different country entirely. She leaked information to a rival of Volkov's, a Turkish syndicate leader, suggesting that Crimson 9 was in Istanbul, preparing to dismantle his operation next. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare designed to make Volkov paranoid, to make him question his own intelligence, and to divert his attention and resources. In his Geneva penthouse, Alexei Volkov swept a $200,000 crystal vase from a marble pedestal, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces on the floor. His face was a mask of cold fury. His aide stood trembling by the door, afraid to speak. "She's not just running," Volkov hissed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She's playing with us. She is mocking me." He turned, his eyes burning with a furious, obsessive light. "Pull the hunters from Istanbul. Pull them from everywhere. I want every asset we have focused on that city. Find her. I don't care what it costs." In her motel room, Mara watched the digital fallout of her actions ripple across the globe. She saw the news of the shipping disaster, the whispers of the banking audit, the sudden, frantic movement of Volkov's known assets towards Virginia. She turned to Jax, who had been watching over her shoulder, his expression a mixture of awe and alarm. "We just made him angry," she said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "Now he'll get sloppy. He'll overcommit. He'll pull his best hunters from whatever they were doing and send them all here, to this one place." She looked at Jax, her eyes like chips of ice. "That's what we want. We're not running from the storm. We're calling it down on top of us. We're choosing the battlefield." The battlefield was chosen. It was the anchor. They returned late at night, long after the last streetlights had painted the empty roads in lonely shades of orange. The bar, which had been a place of raucous life and, for Mara, a quiet sanctuary, now felt like a tomb waiting to be filled. The air was still and heavy, thick with the ghosts of laughter and the scent of stale beer, but a new tension overlaid it all, a sharp, metallic tang of anticipation. In the center of the room, spread across the SEAL's favorite round table, was not a collection of beer mugs and pretzel bowls, but a dusty, rolled-up blueprint of the building Mara had retrieved from the county records office. A single battery-powered lantern cast a pool of stark white light onto the paper, throwing their faces into sharp relief and casting long dancing shadows against the wood, paneled walls. The men of Jax's team, the most elite warriors in the world, stood around the table, their expressions grim and focused, their familiar confidence replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. They were in her world now, and they knew it. Mara's finger, slender and steady, traced a line on the blueprint. "He'll want to do this personally," she said, her voice a low, calm current in the silent room. "Not the fight itself. He has people for that, but the aftermath. He's arrogant, a narcissist. His victory isn't complete until he can stand on the ground where his enemy fell and savor it." Her finger tapped the center of the blueprint, the spot where they were all standing, "and he'll want to do it in the place where I tried to hide, to mock the quiet, invisible life I chose. It's a symbolic act. He's not just killing me, he's killing the idea that I could ever escape him." She looked up, her gaze sweeping over their faces, each man a study in controlled power. "This is where he'll come. This is our kill box." Kai, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern. "But it's a civilian location," he argued, his voice a respectful murmur. "It's a wooden bar, not a fortress. The walls are drywall and old timber. The windows are plate glass. We could set up in a warehouse, a concrete structure we can properly fortify." "Exactly," Mara replied, her eyes glinting in the lantern light. "They will expect us to choose a fortress. Their assault teams are trained to breach hardened targets, to use explosives and heavy weapons. They won't be prepared for a fight here, not a real one. They'll see this place as a soft target, a simple snatch and grab. They will be loud, overconfident, and focused on overwhelming force." She looked around the familiar, comfortable room, seeing it not as a bar, but as a web of tactical possibilities. "We won't use fortification. We'll use their assumptions against them. We will use the home field to our advantage. Every creaking floorboard, every faulty light fixture, every hidden corner. They are coming into our house." Jax, who had been listening intently, nodded his slow, deliberate nod. He understood. It was the classic guerrilla strategy, turning the enemy's strength into a weakness. They would expect a hammer, and they would find smoke. They would expect a wall, and they would find a maze. He trusted her judgment completely. Later, as the team began the quiet work of mapping out sightlines and planning movement corridors, Jax found Mara standing alone by the bar. The work light she always used was on, casting a solitary glow on her face. She was staring at the screen of her tablet, which was propped up against the beer taps. On the screen was the photograph of Dmitri, his face impassive and professional, standing at Volkov's shoulder. The sight of it, of her staring at this ghost from her past, sent a pang of something protective through Jax. He walked over, his boots making no sound on the worn floorboards. "You knew him," he said. It wasn't a question. Mara didn't look up from the screen for a long moment. Her thumb traced the outline of Dmitri's face on the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy, freighted with a guilt so old it had become a part of her. "He was young, like Kai," she began, her voice barely a whisper, eager. "He believed in the mission, in what we were doing, with every cell in his body. It was his first deep cover-up. I was his handler." She finally looked away from the screen, her eyes distant and haunted. "The mission in Odessa, it went sideways. Our comms were compromised. Volkov knew he had a traitor, he just didn't know who. I had to make a choice." She took a shaky breath, the first crack in her iron composure Jax had ever seen. Him, or the objective. The objective was to dismantle Volkov's entire network, to stop him from selling a weapon that would have killed thousands. It was the cold, brutal math of the job. Her gaze fell to her own hands, resting on the polished wood of the bar. "I made the call. I used his compromised position to feed Volkov false intel, leading him into the final trap. And then I reported Dmitri as compromised and killed in action. It was the last report I ever filed." Jax felt the weight of her confession settle in the space between them. It was the kind of impossible choice soldiers understood, the kind that left scars no one could see. He reached for the only comfort he knew how to offer, the cold logic of their profession. "You saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives with that call, Mara." Her head snapped up, and her eyes, for the first time, flashed with a raw, bitter anger. A humorless, painful smile twisted her lips. "Go tell that to the ghost who's coming to kill me," she said, her voice dripping with self-loathing. The battle to come wasn't just for her survival, he realized. It was for her atonement. She had to face the living, breathing embodiment of her most profound failure, a failure that had been twisted into her enemy's most personal weapon. The ghost of Dmitri was not just a threat. He was her judge and her executioner, and in some dark part of her soul, she seemed to believe she deserved whatever sentence he was coming to deliver. The work began in earnest. The team, now a seamless extension of Mara's will, moved through the bar with a quiet, focused efficiency that was breathtaking to behold. They were a unit transformed. The boisterous, confident SEALs were gone, replaced by silent, methodical operators who followed the instructions of the quiet woman in the gray jumpsuit without question or hesitation. They were no longer just soldiers, they were craftsmen, and their medium was chaos. The preparations were not about building defenses, but about setting a stage. It was intricate, subtle, and devious. Kai, an expert in electronics, was tasked with rewiring the bar's entire electrical system. The main lights, the beer signs, the television, and even the old jukebox were all routed through a small remote-controlled relay Mara had provided. With the press of a button on her tablet, she could plunge the entire building into darkness or, worse, into a disorienting strobe of flashing, colored lights and blaring music. Two other SEALs worked in the cellar, carefully, painstakingly weakening a section of the main floor behind the bar, sawing through the support joists until they were held together by just enough wood to bear a person's weight, but not enough to withstand a sudden, dynamic impact. It was a deadfall trap, simple, ancient, and brutally effective. Others moved through the rooms, placing tiny, pinhole cameras in strategic locations, in the eye of a mounted fish on the wall, inside a smoke detector, tucked into the corner of a ceiling vent. Every angle was covered, feeding a live, multi-screen view to Mara's tablet. They prepared non-lethal diversions, small, custom, made flash, bangs that would disorient with sound and light but produce minimal concussive force, and smoke emitters that would fill a corridor with thick vision, obscuring vapor in seconds. They were not rigging the bar with explosives, they were weaponizing the environment itself. Jax watched them work, a sense of profound awe settling over him. He saw his men, the best special operators in the world, learning a new kind of warfare. They were used to being the overwhelming force, the hammer that shattered down the door. Mara was teaching them to be the unseen current that pulls a man under, the whisper in the dark that makes him question his own sanity. She moved among them, her voice a low murmur, offering precise instructions, correcting an angle, suggesting a better placement. She was in her element, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of controlled chaos. The respect his men had for her was absolute, a quiet reverence for a master of a craft they were only just beginning to comprehend. As the first hint of dawn threatened to break the eastern horizon, the work was done. The bar looked exactly as it always did, quiet, empty, and waiting for the morning. But it was now a living weapon, a web of subtle and deadly traps, all leading to the center. The stage was set. The tension in the air was a palpable thing, a low hum that vibrated in their bones. They were no longer waiting for a fight, they were waiting for the curtain to rise. Jax gathered his team in the kitchen, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. "Listen up," he said, his voice a low, serious growl. "Forget what you learned in training. Forget the standard operating procedures. We are not the hammer anymore. We're the scalpel. We are ghosts. You will not fire a single shot unless I give the direct order, or unless Mara does. You will move silently. You will follow the plan, and you will trust her judgment above your own." He looked each of his men in the eye, his gaze hard as steel. "Watch her, learn from her, and do exactly as she says. There are no second chances here. Stay sharp." The silence of the night was the first casualty. It was shattered by the soft, synchronized crunch of gravel as three black, unmarked vans slid to a halt in the alley behind the anchor. The doors slid open without a sound, disgorging a dozen figures clad in black tactical gear. They moved with the fluid, deadly precision of apex predators, their movements economical and silent. At their head was Dimitri, his face a cold, impassive mask, his eyes scanning the dark, silent building. He raised a hand, and the team froze, melting into the shadows. From his vantage point across the street, Volkov watched on a monitor, a smug smile playing on his lips. He expected to witness the swift, brutal capture of a single, washed-up woman. Dimitri's voice was a low hiss over their encrypted comms. "All teams in position. She's in there. Intel says she's alone." He paused, his gaze sweeping the building one last time. "They know we're here," he murmured, a flicker of unease touching him as he noted the unnatural darkness, the way the streetlights on this specific block were dead. It was too perfect. Standard entry protocol. Breach on my mark. Go. With a series of soft thuds from suppressed rams, the front and back doors of the anchor burst inward simultaneously. The mercenaries poured into the building, weapons raised, night vision goggles painting the world in eerie shades of green. They found nothing. The bar was empty, silent, and still. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and lemon polish. It was exactly as it should be, and that was what felt so wrong. Suddenly, the old jukebox in the corner exploded to life, not with music, but with a deafening blast of static, a high-pitched shriek that overloaded their sensitive audio receivers. At the exact same moment, every light in the bar, from the neon beer signs to the overhead fixtures, began to strobe violently, a chaotic, disorienting assault of flashing colors and blinding white light. The mercenaries, their night vision now useless, flinched back, momentarily blinded and deafened. It was the only opening Mara and the SEALs needed. From the shadows of the kitchen, from the darkness of the cellar, from the hidden alcoves they had prepared, they struck. It was not a firefight, it was a harvest. Jax and his men moved like phantoms, their takedowns swift, silent, and non-lethal. A chokehold here, the sharp crack of a pressure point strike there. One mercenary, turning in confusion, stepped onto the weakened floorboards behind the bar and plunged into the darkness of the cellar below with a startled cry that was cut short by the thud of his landing. The traps worked in perfect concert with the SEALs' movements, isolating and neutralizing the elite hunters one by one. The fight devolved into a tense, lethal game of cat and mouse in the strobing darkness and screaming static. It came down to Mara versus Dimitri. She saw him moving through the chaos, his skill a cut above the others, his movements a dark mirror of her own. He was anticipating the traps, sidestepping the deadfalls, his training, her training, serving him well. It was a battle of wits and skill, a brutal ballet of two ghosts haunting the same space, each anticipating the other's moves. They finally came face to face in the center of the main room, the strobing lights catching their faces in brief, stark flashes of clarity. "I worshipped you," Dimitri snarled, his voice raw with years of festering betrayal. He lunged, not with a gun, but with a knife, the blade a flicker of silver in the chaotic light. "I would have died for you. You left me to rot." Mara met his attack, parrying the knife with a practiced move, the steel of her forearm guard ringing against his blade. "I made a choice, Dmitri," she said, her voice steady even as they grappled, their bodies straining against each other. "A terrible one. I've lived with it every single day." She twisted, using his momentum against him, forcing him back. "But Volkov isn't the answer. He's just another monster. He gave me a purpose." Dmitri spat, breaking free and slashing at her again. Revenge. Their fight was brutal, personal, and heartbreakingly intimate. He knew her feints, she knew his counters. It was like fighting her own reflection in a distorted mirror. But Mara was the master, and he was the student. She saw the opening he left, a fractional overextension born of rage. She moved inside his guard, disarmed him with a sharp twist of his wrist that sent the knife clattering across the floor, and slammed him back against the bar. She had him pinned, her forearm pressed against his throat, her body a coiled spring of lethal energy. The fight was over. The static from the jukebox died, plunging the room into a sudden, ringing silence. "It's over, Dmitri," she said, her voice heavy with a sorrow that went beyond the fight. Just as the words left her lips, the front doors of the Anchor swung open, spilling calm, normal light into the chaotic darkness. Alexei Volkov himself walked calmly into the bar, flanked by two bodyguards so massive they had to turn sideways to fit through the door. He was smiling, a smug, victorious look on his face. He had waited for his team to clear the building, for the sounds of struggle to cease. He began to applaud slowly, the sound a mocking desecration of the silence. "Bravo, Crimson Nine," he said, his voice dripping with condescending admiration. "Truly, a magnificent performance, but the show is over." He raised a heavy, silver pistol, its barrel a dark, unblinking eye aimed directly at her heart. Suddenly, the main lights of the bar flashed on, bright and steady. The room was flooded with light, revealing the full extent of the chaos. The unconscious bodies of Volkov's men scattered among the overturned tables, and it revealed something else. The windows were filled with the silhouettes of armed men. The doors were blocked by federal agents in tactical gear, their weapons all trained on Volkov. From the shadows of the kitchen, Jax and his team emerged, their own weapons raised and ready. Jax keyed his comms, his voice calm and clear. "Target is secure." Volkov froze, his smug smile collapsing into a mask of stunned disbelief. His eyes darted around the room, seeing the inescapable trap he had walked into. "How?" he breathed, the single word a gasp of pure shock. Mara pushed herself away from Dmitri, her eyes never leaving Volkov's. She stepped out from behind the bar, a small, weary figure who had just toppled an empire. "The weather report I called for," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of finality. "It wasn't for me, it was for you." Her call on the burner phone had not been to her own dormant network of spies and ghosts. It had been a coded tip, a single cryptic phrase sent to a high-level, multi-agency task force she had a long and complicated history with, a task force led by a man who owed her his life. She had given them the time, the place, and the target. She had not just set a trap for the soldiers, she had set one for their king, using his own arrogance as the bait to deliver him and his entire operation into the hands of justice. In the aftermath, the bar was a controlled scene of quiet efficiency. Dmitri was led away in cuffs, his face not filled with hatred, but with a complex, shattered expression of disillusionment as he looked at Mara one last time. Volkov was gone, whisked away to a black site where his corporate empire and his world of shadows would be systematically dismantled. A man in a crisp uniform with the stars of a general on his collar, a man named Peterson, stood with Mara amidst the wreckage of her former sanctuary. "You did good, Mara," Peterson said, his voice gruff but filled with a deep, genuine respect. "There's always a place for you, if you want it. A consulting role. Trainer. Name your price." Mara looked around the bar. She saw Jax and his team talking with Al, the manager, who was looking at his cleaning lady with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. She saw the familiar wooden beams, the worn tables, the rows of glasses she had polished 1,000 times. It was a mess, but it was her mess. "I think I like my life here," she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in years. "But maybe I'll send you a bill for the cleaning services." Weeks later, the Anchor was back to normal. The laughter was loud, the beer was cold, and the scent of lemon polish once again filled the air. The SEALs were at their usual table, but this time there was an extra chair. Mara brought a round of drinks over, her movements as efficient as ever. But instead of disappearing back into the shadows of the bar, she set the tray down and, with a small, comfortable sigh, sat down with them. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, not a uniform. The dog tag was still fastened to her watch, but it no longer felt like a burden, a secret to be hidden. It was just a part of her. She was no longer Crimson 9, the ghost. She was no longer Mara Quinn, the invisible cleaner. She was just Mara, finally at peace, in a place she had chosen, surrounded by a new kind of family, people who knew exactly who she was and who raised their glasses to her in a silent, heartfelt salute.